This week's Parsha talks about the very interesting halacha that you need to have a fence over any house that you build. Any house or any structure that you own needs to have a fence on the roof, as the Torah tells us of the very simple reason for it, so nobody goes on and falls off, you won't be liable, they won't get hurt, and everyone's happy. What's interesting is that this law, this halacha, is so far-reaching that, as the Sifri tells us, every house needs to have one, every structure needs to have one, even the Beis HaMikdash needs to have one. In many diagrams of the Beis HaMikdash, you will see a roof fence on top of the Heichal, not just for design, but because, just like any other structure, it also needs a fence. Sounds pretty simple, until you look a little more into halacha and you find that a shul, or any public property, any property owned by the community, does not need to have a fence on the roof. And that brings us to a very big issue, because shouldn't the Beis HaMikdash fall into that category? The Beis HaMikdash, which is the ultimate public space, it really just belongs to Hashem and effectively all of us to go and connect to Hashem there, to bring karbanis there. It is not owned by a particular person, and that makes it all the more confusing why the Beis HaMikdash would need to have a fence installed on its roof if it's not private property. The Rogatchover Gaon gives a very interesting answer. He says that unlike any other holy structure, the Beis HaMikdash was built in a way that first it was unholy materials and an unholy structure, and then it was made holy. And while it was unholy, would have the laws to a fence, and therefore even after it was made holy, the fence stayed. But asks the Rebbe on this answer is that there are some opinions who do maintain that if something was not holy and then the structure became holy, you do take the fence off. So according to this view, how would you explain that the Beis HaMikdash had a fence on its roof? So explains the Rebbe that we need to understand why a private-owned property needs to have a fence on its roof. The answer is very simple. As Rashi tells us, the reason why you need to have it is because you are responsible for your property, and therefore if someone falls down, you are liable for it. In contrast to a shul, or a study hall, where it is effectively owned by all Jews, there is not a legitimate person to make responsible for if someone were to fall and get hurt. Because even though not every Jew contributed to the funding of the shul, it is effectively owned by all Jews. Therefore, we wouldn't necessarily know who to make liable to pay if someone were to fall, because theoretically it belongs to every Jew. In contrast to the Beis HaMikdash, where we know for a fact that every Jew did contribute. Every Jew at the time gave all their gold and their silver to the construction of the Beis HaMikdash, and all Jews were living in a close area at that time. And therefore, if someone were to be on the roof of the Beis HaMikdash and he were to fall down, every single Jew would be able to compensate him. That is why the Beis HaMikdash does have to have a fence. But explains the Rebbe that it's much more deeper than this. Because the roof of the Beis HaMikdash is not necessarily the physical roof that once stood thousands of years ago and will stand when Mashiach comes. But it also represents the Beis HaMikdash inside of every one of us. A roof is a lot of times connected to the idea of being high up, holding yourself high up, and sometimes a little bit too high up, having ego, having gaiva. And with that, the Torah tells you, make a fence around it. Keep that control, because there is no good that is in ego. Set boundaries, limitations, safeguards, so that nothing bad comes as a result of it. The Torah tells us, make a fence so you don't fall over, because as we know, negative character, spiritual ego, and even physical ego is the start of a person's downfall. And you need to have a fence even on the Beis HaMikdash. Even when you feel you are at the highest point, you made it in life, you're on the level of the Beis HaMikdash, you've reached it all, there needs to be a fence around that as well. Because until Mashiach comes, anything is susceptible to ego and bad and klipa. And therefore the Torah gives us a very important safeguard. And when we channel that in the right way, when we take our ego not as a personal ego, but as Gaon Yaakov, Jewish pride for being Hashem's chosen nation, then Hashem will follow suit, ultimately bringing the coming of Mashiach, when we will see the Beis HaMikdash once again, speedily in our days. Wishing you a wonderful Shabbos.